talking to me because I drove a taxi cab in the 1970s. And that happens to be a time when Scorsese made his Taxi Driver movie.
It was a different world then than what it is now.
What adjectives can I use to describe it? The destruction of civilization.
What are you doing? You just hit the cab.
What it comes to when things have no rules and no laws and no regulations.
The guy pulls out an axe.
I was scared to death to ever go to Times Square.
A silver, long-handled axe.
Almost every doorway was something X-rated.
He's like gonna swing it at me like this, right?
In the daytime, noon, lunchtime, if you were walking down the street, you better be looking over your shoulder, literally.
So I stayed away from those areas. I stayed away from Times Square.
I said, there's a man with an axe in the meatpacking district.
I mean, if you weren't tough in New York City in the 70s, you'd get eaten up alive. Mr. Bickle wasn't wrong. The scum of the earth, and it looked like Dante's Inferno, man. It was hell. My grandfather came to this country in the early 1900s, and when he learned English, he drove a taxi cab. And my father ended up driving a taxi cab. I was going to college in the early 70s, and I needed some money, so I drove a taxi cab part-time. I started driving more and going to college less. Driving a taxi became a career. As awkward as the character De Niro played was, man, you could relate to it. You could relate to being, in your own mind, being the hero to people, you know? I mean, people say we're ambassadors of the city. Well, we're the eyes and ears of the city, and we might not have a badge, you know, or wear a gun, although some of us may have had weapons.
Okay, my name is Frank. Drove a taxi in New York City for 13 years, from 70s to 80s. Sometimes on and off, sometimes steady. I had many great experiences. I grew up in taxi. I grew up in New York streets. And what you see on the cabs, what you see in the streets, the real life of New York City, sometimes it can get so ugly. It affects you, regardless. You see so much injustice. You see so much of this filth that we have, so much of greatness and goodness at the same time. But the filth, if you have some righteousness in you, some truthfulness in you, some humanity in you, the wrongs you see on the street is not easy to swallow.
I've lived in every major metropolitan area in the country for at least 6 years each. New York is the best because it's never boring. Cab driving was the greatest adventure I ever did. Transvestite hooker got in the back of the cab my first night. This is what I get, my first fare, my first night, Times Square. Here she gets hailing me from the street with her long fingernails and her feather boa and her patent leather bikini with chains hanging. She looked like a girl almost, except when she opened her mouth, right? She gets in, go over there, I'm picking up my boyfriend. She picks up this real rough-looking guy. Well, they're in the back seat, and I'm looking in the rearview mirror. I don't see them. Well, we know what's going on, right? So then I take them up to York. They get out of the cab. She tipped well, I have to say. I was a little afraid of my life because it was my first time, my first fare. I was a little afraid, like, oh, God, what are they going to do? I pull away. I pick up a lady, a nice, very nice, like a cleaning lady, actually, from one of the apartments, and she says, you know, there's something back here. I said, really? She said, what is this? I pulled over, I looked at the bottom from the transvestite's outfit was in the back of the cab, my first souvenir.
You know, taxi drivers would talk to it. You'd have the old-timers with the cigars back then, you know, who didn't even see the movie, or some that did, who, you know, talked it down. But the young guys like us, man, we knew what it was all about, you know, and it could have very easily been any one of us taking that next move and getting off the seat you know, to help a young runaway or something like that, because they were right around here at Times Square. I mean, the pimps would hang out around here looking for young girls getting off the buses, running away from home. You know, I think driving a cab brings out the goodness in you, because you try to be a good person and you try to do something that's positive, and you try to help people as much as you can, you know, getting involved sometimes. I mean, I remember not too far from here, this guy was yelling and beating his wife up on the street. Lord knows what happened. I was driving by, hopped out of my cab. The guy was a lot bigger than I am now, you know, and here I am, you know, like 20 years old. And I'm saying, hey man, what are you doing? Leave the woman alone. And she looks at me and yells at me, mind your own fucking business. And that taught me something also, you know, so there she is being abused, and it's like, man, you can't even help certain people.
The TLC is the Taxi and Limousine Commission. You have to get your city license through them to drive a cab. It's called a hack license.
Hack has something to do with Hackney, I think, from the British, you know, and it kind of lingered around. So hack is short for Hackney, those coaches in London, from what I understand.
So they call it a hack license. And you have to have that to drive a cab.
I remember I went down to take the hack license test, and they give you a list of 10 hotels and their locations, and they say study it as long as you want. And when you were ready, they took that list away and gave you a second list of just the hotels, and you had to write down where the locations were. And that was it. If you got, I think, 6 or 7 out of 10 right, you got a hack license. You know, quite different from today.
In the 70s, most drivers owned their own cabs. And the ones that didn't, the ones that rented, it was on a different payment schedule where they took a share of the income, and the garage took another share. It was a little more fair. Now they have to pay a fee. It's a whole different setup.
Today, there's an 80-hour course drivers have to take. The first part of it is English proficiency. So if you fail that, you're not allowed to continue. And 80 hours, they cover an awful lot, you know, mostly geography, but an awful lot. So, you know, people have to realize today, you know, your driver may not be the same color as you, but if he's driving a yellow cab in New York City, he speaks English as well or maybe better than you do.
The TLC wasn't involved till later. The 80s, I think. The TLC came in late 80s. Plus in the 70s, most of the drivers were New Yorkers. Brooklyn, Bronx, Queens, you know, Travis Bickle. I mean, that type of man, you know. It was like they were all from here.
I mean, in the 70s, when I started driving, you had mostly Russians, Italians, and Jews. You know, mixed in with, you know, other people from other backgrounds, but that was it mostly. And then you'd see different people coming from countries. When Russia opened up their immigration gates, Russians came into the business, Greeks came into the business, Indians came into the business. So today, 90% of the drivers are Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi. But those are the Italians, Irish, and Jews from the 70s.
I came to America 29 years ago. Main goal was education, mission unaccomplished. I started working here and there. I did many things in America, from pumping gas to washing dishes. It's been okay. I mean, I enjoy driving. I enjoy. My hardest part of my day is my first 2-3 hours. And after that, I just open up. It becomes more enjoyable.
It would be in an average day, a cab driver makes about 200 miles a day in a 10-12 hour shift. In 200 miles, you probably circumvent the whole New York City area at least 2 times, 3 times. So you would never know where you're gonna end up or where you're gonna be and who you're gonna pick up. It's a great adventure.
Like when you get home after driving a 12-hour shift, you can't sleep. You're wired. You're wired from the traffic, from the noise, from what you hear now in the background. You know, you're wired, and you don't fall asleep for hours sometimes. And I gotta tell you, I could seldom drive 2 days in a row. I don't know how those men do it, the Romanians, for example, 7 days a week. But they're in their 20s.
cab driver can be lonely if they choose to be. You know, this is a lonely job, but it's up to you to make it unlonely, you know, if that makes sense. It's, you have to be a conversationalist. You have to talk to your passengers, and that kind of makes the day go by much faster, or the ride go by much faster.
Being lonely and being, you know, people perceive you as a low life because you're driving a cab. You know, it's one of the things you just have to brush off your shoulders. You know, if you're not tough, you know, and if you can't handle criticism, and it's not even warranted criticism, you know, it's just some jerk-off's opinion of taxi drivers. You know, maybe his daddy, you know, gave him a job in a business. Well, you know what? If you're working hard, there's nothing wrong with it.
Most people will appreciate a conversation from a cab driver. They're even surprised these days to find a cab driver who not only is a conversationalist, but who can speak the language, which is kind of a sad way of looking at it, but it's an unfortunate fact that, that some cab drivers will lack the skills to hold a decent conversation with a passenger, or some will just choose not to say anything.
One of the things I found driving a taxi is the yearning that I had, and I guess we all have, to share your life with other people, you know, because, you know, to me, communication was a big thing, speaking to people. And without that, I mean, you know, you're in that tin box 12 hours a day. You know, there were partitions. I kept mine open. I always kept mine open. I needed to speak to the people. I needed to learn about the world. I needed people to hear what I had to say and learn from them also. It is lonely, but you know, taxi drivers in New York City back then, or even today when you drive nights, late at night, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4 in the morning, you get that pulse of the city. You know where it's happening, you know the hot spots.
I usually come out around 8, 9 o'clock and then finish around 8, 9 o'clock. I wanted originally to get a radio car, drive a black car, but I know a couple of people in the business, taxi business, and they told me that if I wanted to drive, taxi was the only thing to drive in New York City. They told me that it was actually much better investment than the black cars. So I took their advice and I worked for Fleet for about 4 or 5 months before I made up my mind.
I'm Baidevi Desai. I'm the executive director of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, which is a union of New York City taxi cab drivers, and we're over 7,000 members strong. The city itself has a vested interest in the value of the medallion, which is a number you see on top of the famous yellow cab in New York City, but that number just happens to be worth $500,000.
It's actually a right that the city sells you. Yellow cabs are the only cabs you have the right to pick up street hails. You know, no one else. If you put your hand up, anything else but a yellow cab stops, he's breaking the law and you're breaking the law.
Now, back in the 1970s, at that time period, in about 1972, the medallion was valued at $35,000. And all that value comes from the sweat of the drivers.
I have a big debt in my medallion I have to pay off, and I have a daughter in college. There is no benefits provided to us by the city. We are considered independent contractors, basically, and then we have to purchase our own health insurance. So there is no benefits, there's no retirement benefits, there's basically nothing. And the only benefit that one would have driving a cab, if you own it, is the value of the medallion, hopefully keeps going up, and then at the end, when you want to retire, you have something. You have the money that you're going to get from your medallion to retire with. And that's what my retirement benefit is in this business. But if you're a fleet driver, those guys don't get anything, unfortunately.
Well, the taxi cab drivers are very famous worldwide too. Everybody thinks that if you get into a cab and you talk to the cab driver, he's going to give you the inside dope about politics in New York and everything else. It's ridiculous. They don't know any more than anybody else, but they know something. And they're tough, and they have to be tough because there are periods, thank God we seem to be past that now with law enforcement, but there were periods of time when cab drivers were one of the most dangerous of professions.
We're proud of the fact that taxi drivers are the ambassadors of this city. You know, when you watch a TV show or a movie or you see a magazine picture, you know it's New York City when you see that yellow cab. You know, but we want to be the symbol of not just New York City, but we want to be the symbol of working conditions with dignity and respect. The Taxi Limousine Commission is an agency of the mayor's office. Now, in theory, they are the impartial public servants, right? The so-called government.
There's no question that the Taxi Limousine Commission has tried to upgrade service and also upgrade protections and revenues for the cab driver and the cab companies.
The TLC is hated, but it's a necessary evil. The whole industry would go in chaos without them. But don't ask too many cab drivers that, because they don't like it. They're, you know, they charge, the tickets are exorbitant. They look for any little thing that the drivers do to give them a ticket. They really sometimes are out to get them.
Well, the Taxi Commission, you know, how to regulate the New York City taxi industry. And before that, I think it was up to the City Council. But the Taxi and Limousine Commission started with rules and regulations, you know, ever so slowly. And it really wasn't until the Giuliani administration where things got real tough. And I mean, the first year he came down with rules, 700 drivers lost their licenses instantaneously. And there's a point system for your driving record. You're drug tested every year. You know, the public safety comes first.
I'm gonna tell you why I stopped driving a cab. Pick up this guy from West Side, somewhere in West Side, 2:30 in the morning. And he comes in with an attaché case, and he says, LaGuardia. And I turn around to him, I said, sir, I said, who goes to LaGuardia 2:30 in the morning? There's no flights going out, there's no flights coming in. Oh, he says, I had my private jet taking me to Boston. He says, if you don't want to go, he says, I'll take another cab. He was very gentleman about it. So I said, what are you doing at 2:30? Where are you going? What do you do? Who are you? I mean, you know. So we start talking. He said to me, he said, I'm a consultant. And he said, they pay me $60,000 for consultation. And then he says, I make my living like that. I said, why don't you consult me too? And he looked at me. I looked at him from the mirror. I see his face. He says, I would. But he says, I don't do my occupation free. He says, you make this cab free to do LaGuardia Airport for the fare? He says, I'll give you consultation. I said, it's fair enough. He started asking me, he says, anything I ask you, he says, please answer me in best of your ability, honestly as you can. What do you do? What's your education level? What do you like? What you don't like? How long you been here? What's your background? You know, all these personal questions. You know, what's your sex life, etc., etc. By the time we closed the conversation, his questions, we almost came to his stop, one of those gates in LaGuardia. And he got off the cab, and he says, I'm not gonna pay you the fare. He says, because I'm gonna use my occupation. But he says, here's a 20 bucks tip for you. And he says, $60,000 consultation to you. He says, let me be the last customer you pick up and get off this seat and go live your life. This is not you. Next day, I left the taxi. After 13 years, I stopped driving. I get off that seat. That seat is a sickness. You get stuck on that seat once you're in that driver's seat. And I see a lot of cabbies stuck on that seat. They love it, they hate it. There's a love and hate relationship. It's a good living. We all have to do make a living, but it's a tough living. It's a hard way of earning living. Every day, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, you're driving, riding other people where they want to go. That's the story of my end of my cab drive.
Well, when I was a taxi driver, you know, I mean, there was very little guidance back then. And, you know, today, in today's world, there are so many rules and rule changes and meetings and things going on. There's no real way to tell the drivers, give them information. So I have a small taxi newspaper called Taxi Insider that I put out monthly, and I hand distribute most of it. Drivers enjoy it, they respect it. I'm also the executive director of the Committee for Taxi Safety. And what I do is I represent the industry at the Taxi and Limousine Commission and at City Hall. And if anything detrimental to the industry occurs, I try to fight for the rights of the drivers and the licensees.
nycabbie.com is my website. Right. I put it, I wanted to make it more like the drivers of the 70s, 50s, and 60s. A driver who knew a lot about everything, where people can write me, and I do get a lot of letters with questions, romance questions, which are kind of fun. Some people are crazy. I send them to a therapist and tell them I'm not one. You know, things like that.
Driving a taxi cab in New York City was the greatest experience in the world. It really was, you know. And I think a prerequisite for life, for every human being, drive a taxi cab in New York City for 1 year and learn what life is all about. Around the world, and you learn about yourself too.